Hello. Good day, I think. Morning. Morning is over. I'm very pleased to see so many people. That's great. Because 2 years ago, here at ECE, I did a presentation with a title called Metamerism and Metameric Failure. Probably the most boring and incomprehensible title you could imagine for a session, I guess at least to most cinematographers and colorists it was. Still, there were quite a lot of people. So this year I thought I'd come up with a title that is as catchy as it can be, even kind of subliminally trying to sell you the magic LUT maybe. Maybe you can take that away from you. And I'm pleased to see maybe it worked. I see a pretty full audience. That's great. My name is Dirk Meier. I'm a colorist and a lecturer. I'm also a member of the German Society of Cinematographers and the Colorist Society, CSI. And I'm here now on behalf of the Margot Technical Committee, where I'm also a member. And today I want to talk about look. At least the majority of this talk will be around this term and how we can maybe, hopefully, try to understand the ingredients of a look. As a very recent inspiration, just from listening to a bit of a talk at the BVK booth about analog film, and the previous session here about the future of teaching cinematography and how that will work. That also revolved a lot about artificial intelligence, of course, and how that influences the education and the work of cinematographers, of course. And also there, quite some examples came that involved the term look. And this really supports my thought why I wanted to come up with a session, that I believe there is still a lot to understand about the very detailed and minute ingredients about of the look of an image. We're dealing with them just every day on our phones, on our whatever displays we're looking at in professional cinematography and cinema, of course, in many, many ways. And we communicate a lot, even in preparation before we actually start to shoot something. We communicate a lot with reference images. And my experience is that it always needs some time to understand what the other person means if they show me a picture and say, I really like the look of this image, I really like it's very contrasting and so on. But then I look at it, but it's I don't think it's so contrast. What do you mean by contrast? And contrast is one of my favorite examples, just to say we have so many different ways to define what contrast is and to talk and to use this term that it is complicated, right? So how do we tackle this? How do we actually go about what the look of an image is? So I thought I'd bring you a few stills. The projection here isn't adapted to the viewing conditions, but at least this is dimmed down a little bit. And I'd like to do this a little bit interactive. So quick show of hands, who's actually a cinematographer here? Yeah, so who's a gaffer? Any camera operators? First ACs? Who's a colorist? Yeah, so who's a director? Any directors, filmmakers, other industry professionals? Okay, there were a couple of people not showing their hands. So I would like to ask, well, you're teaching, you're a colorist, as I learned from the previous session, right, as well? So you're out here. You are what? DIT, okay, great. So I would like to ask you to pick a picture of those four, but don't tell us. And to quickly, doesn't have to be elaborate, but to describe the look of the image. And by that I mean no description of the content. Four people sitting on the floor is not part of the look, right? And to make it a bit more challenging, you also should not name the dominant color, like, oh, there's a lot of red in it. Yeah, okay. So what would you say? You didn't expect that kind of pressure and challenge, and yeah, I know. Sorry.
It has.
I offer you a free coffee afterwards at the BVK booth.
Thank you. So it has really vibrant colors with deep blacks and minor but really strong highlights.
Okay.
Kind of.
Okay, so let's ask the next person here. What do you think? Which picture did you choose?
I think this will be the this one was four guys.
On the bottom right.
Yeah.
Correct?
No, that wasn't the one.
So the top left?
Yes.
The top left one. Okay. But good attempt. But I hope that little exercise, also the time that you needed to think about, and if you did that experiment in your own minds, you might have acknowledged that it's not so easy. It's not so easy to say something more that it's really contrasty, lots of colors. To be a bit more precise with that, we need more terms. We need maybe a better understanding of what actually all goes into that look. And it's maybe not only about the colors and if there's lots of blacks or highlights, strong highlights, and so on, right? Because we are professionals and we need to communicate that already in pre-production with a lot of people to actually help us to conceive the look that we want in the final images. But to make it maybe a little bit easier, before we start to describe an image or come up with terminologies and definitions and so on, I thought, as a simpler example how to tackle this, let's use a table. If you want to have a new table for your dining room, but you don't want to shop one, you want to go to a carpenter and actually have that made for yourself. What do you need to communicate to that person to get the table that you want? Yeah? I don't want to put more pressure on people sticking the microphone in yet, but I would guess you come up with, yeah, we need to talk about the size, right? We need maybe to come up with even a metric, something we can measure so that we can communicate in a standardized way how big the table should be. And then maybe the form, the shape of it. Well, here I picture just a rectangular tabletop, but of course we know there are almost endless amounts of variations of tables that have been built already, and they can be of a circular oval, or they have kind of rounded corners and so on. So there are a couple of aspects, if you look at all of these, that we want maybe to add to the description, to basically the recipe on how to build our table. But then again, if you dissect this a little bit, it's not too complicated. If we say, for the size, we need to define the width, the depth, then maybe also the height or the thickness of the actual tabletop, combined with a shape, whether it's an oval, a circle, a rectangle, or a square. Then we already have done quite a good job. Then at least we know, well, it's going to fit in our dining room. And then maybe we also want to define what is the actual material. So how does it look? And is that material polished in a certain way? Is it actually painted? Is it glossy or not? And is the tabletop made of wood or glass? And are the legs, what kind of shape actually have the legs? Are they round and so on? But beyond that, I mean, with that amount of information, we get a pretty good, decent description of our table. Lookup table. Notice that, right? So with images, it's maybe a little bit more complicated, but we hopefully also understood that there are some categories. We have to talk about the size with the table and the material. And then with the material comes also the surface, whether it's polished and so on. There are some kind of subcategories or attributes properties of the table that we can somehow sort into certain categories. And I think with images, we have that as well. I did not come up with that term and with the original idea, you could say, but I adopted a system that I read about from Steve Yedlin and decided, well, he's using maybe a bit too much of academic descriptions, a bit more intuitive. I would say if we look at images, we can define 3 categories, and that is the color itself, the texture, and anything related with motion and or time. Because without time, there's not really motion. So I always struggle whether I should call this category motion or time. It's basically, it's both. We're going to go into some examples and so on, so it becomes more clear. But before that, I want to give the credit and also link to the original categories that Steve Yedlin in his article, you're going to have the link in a second, defined as intrapixel, spatial, and temporal. So intrapixel, everything within the pixel, intra, within the pixel. Spatial, everything that's related to the space. Where is actually that pixel of that finished image, but also you can think about the space on set in the actual scene. And temporal category, of course, deals with, what's the exposure time, for example, and what has that kind of influence on the actual image. Steve Yedlin, member of AEC, he did a presentation at Camera Image 10 years ago, 2015, called Display Prep. That link goes to his article on color science where he talks about these categories. I highly recommend it. It is a little bit academic, but it's worth reading, I think. And it really stuck with me and kind of made me adopt it a little bit for my own purposes. Being a colorist, having the situation of communicating about the look of moving images with different collaborators. So to get a little bit deeper understanding of what does that mean. If you imagine you zoom into a picture up, down to one single pixel, so you only see that pixel. Everything that you can do with that pixel now in color grading, for example, but also you could have done already on set, is to change that one pixel in its appearance, meaning you can make it maybe brighter, you can make it darker. You can change its hue and its intensity, the color, but you don't know where that pixel is within the frame, and you don't know anything about the neighboring pixels. And you basically treat just this one independent of the others. So in this category, we can change a color of a pixel, but we cannot move it around. We cannot do anything. For example, darkening it because it's on the edge. Something that happens when you use a very old lens or just a lens that doesn't fit the actual size of the sensor or the film stock. So then you get some vignetting. That makes an area of the image darker because it's on the edge of the frame and not in the center. And that would be the second category, where we deal with everything, where we need to know where things are. We need to know where it is in the frame and also what the neighboring pixels are. For example, if you use a diffusion filter, that scatters light so that it basically now hits multiple film grains or multiple photosites on the sensor. So that's a spatial effect. Not only one pixel is affected in the end of the final image, but also the neighboring ones. If you do something like a blur or a filter like halation in post-production, that also is dependent on knowing where things are. So that's the second category, which I call texture because it's a bit more intuitive maybe to filmmakers. And the third one, everything related to time, means when things change over time for the image for a particular pixel. So with different frame rates, we have the interaction between exposure time and motion blur. So depending on the movement of camera, of objects, and so on, depending on the actual exposure time, depending on the shutter angle and the frame rate, you get a different result. But also things that actually change over time, like grain, noise, the noise pattern, the electronic noise as well as the film grain changes from frame to frame. So that's an aspect you cannot really kind of see in a still image, but only in the moving picture. So here we are with our temporal domain or category, everything related to time and motion. For me, that is very personal, but it helps to kind of have a structure, to have something that I can apply when actually seeing and analyzing something like an image. So I'm giving reference images, and then I kind of have an internal process going on of looking at the image, trying to analyze where do I actually look, what attracts me, and after that I try to understand why is that the case. Is that the case because of the color that is applied, however it is applied? Is it because there are also some things that actually point me to that, because certain areas are maybe darker or blurred and I can't really see that, but this is very crisp and sharp and in the center. So that's why I kind of want to share this with you. And one important thing to understand is, speaking about that lookup table, as being a table that is applied to every pixel in the picture, independent of where that pixel is, it can only change this one category, color. Yeah? So you cannot emulate film grain with that. You cannot make things sharper. Well, sharpness is really a difficult thing to define again. It is dependent on contrast as well. So you can make things more contrasty, and maybe you actually experience the picture then being somehow sharper. But you cannot apply a blur or grain or anything with a lookup table. Okay. Anyone wants to volunteer and say stop and then give it a go and try to say, what do you think about the colors of this image? In case there are no volunteers, I'm gonna just address someone. Katja, what do you think about the colors of this image? How would you describe that?
Pretty muted colors and a quite narrowed color scheme. It's mainly in the midtones, and there are some highlights and some dark blacks visible, and 1/3 are neutral colors, probably like around 1/3. And the skin tones look pretty faded or muted, or I don't really know how to describe it, but they don't really look natural and alive. And there is like a look onto it that seems like TV-ish. And I don't know, 80s, like.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Maybe you're also influenced by the actual electronic camera you see in the picture.
I'm biased.
Okay, someone. Here, the people hiding in the back row, in the last row, Daniel. So, what about any kind of spatial aspect regarding texture? It's difficult to see if there is any kind of grain or noise from back here. Pure luck, bad luck. Anything you notice? Anything you would say to describe that?
Spatially.
Texture, what could that be? Depth of field.
You mean that the focus is mostly in the middle, and that we have a slight fall off to the edges. You mean that, or just the depth of focus, or depth of field altogether? Yeah, but that doesn't really apply to the lookup table thing.
Then no. Well, if that was confusing, we're beyond the lookup table now. We want to talk about the whole thing. I was just making the point: a lookup table cannot contain anything about those aspects of texture and motion or time, motion blur. I think. Florian, you want to help?
I would think, even though I'm way too far away, that there is some kind of structure in the background, at least, so that it has some kind of a structure here on the surface. So there's something going on, and I would also describe some blurred and clearly soft areas in the frame. So we have a focus on subjects here, and we also have a selective choice of sharpness, in this case chosen probably by the depth of field of that.
Yeah, good. To say anything about the temporal aspects, the motion, if there's not much motion blur, it seems. People seem not to move much. With the exposure time, it seems rather mostly out of focus because of the choice of depth of field. So we can't really say much, and we can't judge the grain that is there that I can see, but it's also a little bit of JPEG compression artifacts there. We would need to see a clip to actually notice that. So I just encourage you to do this as a kind of exercise whenever you come across pictures maybe that you like, that you see, to kind of go and, okay, what do I like about it? How is it? And then applying this little structure, okay, let's look at the colors first, and maybe what do I notice about the texture of it? Is there anything like a very long, obvious exposure time and causing motion blur or something like that? If we look at all those images, something that is very, very important for us, I spoiled you already now, but that of course is skin color, skin tones. In fact, I looked at all the films that are on Shot Deck that I graded and made a little quick survey. How many of those actually do not have any skin color in it? Like not even an arm, a hand, a detail of something, and not a face. And I ended up with 2.7% only. So the vast majority of anything that we create as motion pictures really contains human beings. So skin color is very important for us. Of course, also in grading is always the kind of reference. We have to make sure that people look the way they should look. Sometimes they should look unhealthy, but in most cases we want to make them attractive so that the gaze of the audience is actually steered and attracted by the people in the shot. So as an experiment now, I want to create a very simple test image that we can then analyze, also using scopes, to see what happens if we apply some kind of look. How do things change? So for that, I went to Photoshop and I actually picked some average colors. This is an average skin tone value that I picked from 6 different, very different skin tones that I found. I merged them all up, and just not to irritate us, there are no facial features in there. That's on purpose. What else do we need? Some kind of light source maybe. Let's put a little sun there. Then of course we need background, nice blue sky, right? Maybe a little cloud. Let's put on some shirt for the head so it's not floating in the air. With a bit of extra color so we get a broader palette. We need some green rays, skin tone, sky. These are kind of memory colors, something we encounter in nature, of course, since eons. So that's very important to us. We know these colors. And again, this tree color, the green leaves are actually sampled from a photo that I took. So it's realistic, even though I painted it. And now we want to look at that on a scope. I guess most of you are familiar with that, but I would like to explain this a little bit more. How do these vector scopes and the waveform actually work. If we look at the vector scope, this is a plot of the existing colors in a hue circle, which you can see, right? So there's red is there. There are these markers as well, magenta, and they're just outside of the range, so that you don't see them. But you basically have the full color circle here to guide you where things are. And I also set it up so that you see the color of the actual pixels plotted. So what would that be? The red shirt, of course. Where's our skin tone? Where's our skin color? It's this one. And this has a quite nice feature, this software. It actually allows us to go back and forth between the pictures. So if you look at the face, you can actually follow now where it moves on the scope, right? Same thing for the waveform. This draws the picture from left to right, but the vertical axis only plots the brightness of all of the pixels in that one row. So you go row by row of all the pixels from left to right, and depending on the color and brightness of that pixel, it's plotted over there. So quite easy to see now, okay, that's the shirt. Here's the face with the brighter part on the left where the sun hits the head, and there's the darker part. And again, I can also hit a button and show you how this actually moves from there to there. So you can imagine it as extrapolate the image depending on how bright a pixel is. It's higher, and then you just kind of flip the whole picture around so you look at it from the side, right? I really love this. I could do this all day. That was worth the money for this little tool. So we have the picture, but let's quickly do the whole thing again. So you see where just the skin color is, where the sun is, the sky comes in. But you know something? It's the other way around, right? Because a normal sky is kind of less saturated on the bottom and more on the top. So here it's the other way around. And that makes it actually a little not ideal for my purposes here. So I decided to do two things. We need a little bit more color in that area over there. So I introduce pink bird, and we flip around the sky, because now you actually really can see here the sky, the same orientation as here. And we need one more thing that is really helpful to judge the contrast of the image with a gradient like this with a gray ramp. Okay. But don't we just usually, when we shoot something or we have shot something in color grading, just slap on that super expensive film print emulation lookup table that we bought on the internet, and then just everything looks great and very cinematic, of course? Yeah, of course, let's do that. Here you go. So there's your film look. But this time, I would like you to see what that actually means. And of course, the question will come. This is one version of the Filmbox plugin applying a rather recent Kodak, I think it was a 200T film profile and a print profile as well, which is very important. The negative does only, well, less than half the job of the look. So what you see on the waveform, also the gradient changes a little bit. It actually, and I have this animated so that it goes back and forth now between the original state and the film look, so you can actually really see where things move. How does the color of the skin go? How does it change? How does the contrast change? How does the pink from the bird, the sky color change? And something you realize is that The blues are very much shifted towards cyan. There's a lot more green in there. The skin tone becomes a bit darker and also moves, and if you look in the scopes, then it also becomes a bit darker and more towards orange. You basically see that the separation of the colors in terms of the hue is actually a little bit diminished. It's like it's putting things together, like the pink from the bird and the red of the shirt, they all kind of move a little bit towards an orange area, and the blues towards cyan. But this is only one version of a film print emulation. So let's look at another one. This is the built-in Resolve film look creator in one specific setup. And you see there are significant differences, right? Don't have the time to discuss all of them, but the contrast curve is slightly different. There's not so much of a compression in the shadows, but that is something you can also tweak within the plugins, of course. The colors change, but they have a lot of things really in common how they treat the colors. And right now, I've been only looking at the color differences. Other aspects, other attributes, image attributes, of course, that we relate with the photochemical process of filmmaking are in the texture domain. So that is coming up. Next, it plays back. So here is some kind of lens vignetting and blurring on the edges. On top of that, something you can, of course, do on set, but also with various kind of plugins these days in color grading. We have, when we go to the domain of time, we can also add things. And again, with film acquisition, you get that for free. You can see the little bit of flickering going on actually on the waveform very nicely. And of course, the grain, again, I don't think you see that in the last row, but up here it's pretty clear. I made it pretty big so that you can really see what grain is and how you can see that on the scopes. So these are all examples that I could just recreate here in color grading so we can dissect it, look at it on a very, very simple image to just understand a little bit more what are these different image attributes so that we can then also decide how do we want to manipulate those. If we want to apply any of those within a lookup table, I said we can only use the things in the color domain. And to give you a couple of more terms, image attributes, because we don't have the time to make this really an interactive session where we can write down all the things. And I think in the end, yes, you're welcome to take a picture of that. In the end, I think you need to come up with your own list of terms, because something like color luminance or density is maybe not very native to you and doesn't really ring a bell. So you have to decide what speaks to yourself and how you can use these terms to actually express what you see in an image. But this is something I collected over time and even a bit more, but I didn't want to make it too small on the screen. Just in the domain of color. So if we talk about texture, there's more than just grain. And in fact, grain also belongs to time, as I said before. Okay, go back. But simple aspects like the image resolution and the aspect ratio, of course, is something that is important in images. Sharpness, some very technical term like MTF, edge contrast, focus, diffusion, glow bloom. I mentioned halation, something that is inherent to photochemical acquisition that we became really, really fond of after Steve Yellen basically put it up back on our on our table that since then has been implemented in various tools in color grading, so you can also apply it to digitally acquired material. But I think it's important to understand not only where it comes from, but how it actually works, so that you can use it in a way that kind of suits what you want to achieve. And in time or motion, as I said before, we have the exposure time, the frame rate, motion blur, something called judder. To define that, I would hand over to Dave Stump if you want to hear a specific definition of that. But we are aware that we shouldn't pan too quickly if we shoot at 25 frames per second or 24, because of then the given exposure time. If you move too quickly, there's a disconnect between the individual frames. And especially with higher dynamic range imaging or images, if you have more contrast on the screen, like physical light output, then we're more sensitive. Our vision actually works at a higher frame rate, so then we notice the differences from frame to frame even more. So higher frame rate, shooting for high dynamic range, is actually an interesting idea. So you should join the session tomorrow, I'm not sure in which cinema it is, here or wherever, about a new plugin that allows you to play around with frame rates after you shot it. And since I promised something about lookup tables as well, I said, okay, the lookup table allows us to put something, to change things in the color domain. I at least want to give you my recommendations. When you prepare a lookup table for a feature film or for any kind of project up front, which I highly recommend, that's where the fun begins, and I think I speak for most of my colorist colleagues and friends, that's where we really like to get involved already, so that we can shape the whole look of the project from early on. Ideally, you would like to have something upfront that gives you the final output after final grading, right? That would be great. But of course, that's basically impossible, because one transform, one lookup table cannot fit all lighting situations. You would be, well, challenged quite a lot to light for that one very strong and intense lookup table. You can imagine this lookup table a little bit like a magnifying glass, because it amplifies what you put in. We come from this scene-referred space with these log flat images, and we need to make them more contrasty, more colorful, so they work on our displays. So we increase basically contrast and saturation. So if you change a little bit here with the magnification of the LUT, with the amplification there, if you change that a bit too much, boom, then it's going to explode on the end. There's not enough room in the display space to then handle those lighting changes, for example. So that doesn't really work. One fits all. But I think you can get quite close when you have the time to actually test thoroughly for your production, if you have costume and production design involved and makeup, so that you know really where you're going. And then it's still always a compromise between, okay, you need something that works very, very generic, like the manufacturer's so-called 709 lookup table, versus where you want to go on final grading. And I think it's totally like fine to say we actually start that, or we kind of blend between these two. There's something where we want to go. We have certain aspects. We want certain colors to be really exaggerated or muted, and we want a certain contrast and so on. But it still needs to work. Very generic in lighting situations that you can't control so much. So then you have to find where the middle ground for you is. But in general, I recommend not to change really the sensitivity. So in other words, don't mess around with the mid-gray, where you have mid-gray within the lookup table. So you don't want that patch viewed through your lookup table being too bright or too dark, because then it might change how you actually expose on set. I've had that in the past, so I know from experience that it's not really a good idea. If you need that, if you want a lookup table that really makes things darker or brighter, then make this a technical approach and really say, this is our base lookup table. We don't mess around with the sensitivity there. This is 0, but I also give you a version like -1 or -1.5 or 2 or whatever. But you label it like that so that when you load it in camera, you see, okay, that's actually -1, right? So it makes the picture one stop darker on purpose. Second, similar, maybe not as difficult or problematic, is I wouldn't normally change the white balance a lot with a lookup table. So change it from tungsten to daylight. Like, why would you do that? If you want to really have a warm picture, I would push it more in the midtones, play around with saturation of colors and so on, because otherwise, again, you might lead yourself to, or as a DIT, might lead the cinematographer to change the white balance according to the lookup table. And then you over or underexpose maybe certain channels, which in false color mode, by the way, you cannot see if you clip a single channel, right? Because that only takes the mathematical conversion to black and white, where your red channel is only 23%. So even if you clip your red channel at 150% technically, like going over, you will still not see that really on a waveform that is only luma or in the false color mode. Yeah, just as a reminder. So don't mess with white balance, not too much. I mean, there's usually a lot of wiggle room also later, but as a general recommendation. And then something that some cinematographers that like to use Resolve themselves have fallen for in that pit. There are certain operators, like color grading tools, that actually have a spatial component built in, which is not very obvious. So in Resolve, stay away from the so-called highlight and shadow tool. These have special operations going on in parallel. So if you apply them, it will not translate into a lookup table because a lookup table cannot hold those kind of sharpening effects that are built into them. So here was a project that a friend of mine shot, and it was his first Alexa 35 project 2 years ago. It was in cinemas just recently. And our approach was, well, we don't have much time to do a real test before all the actors come. That's going to be very short notice. So I actually looked around, and he found some lookup tables, apply them on just the generic test chart from RE. And based on his directions, I came up with a suggestion where I used one of these film emulation tools because I like certain aspects of it, but I applied a lot of other tools as well. And then I sent it back, and he actually loaded into the camera. Then they were going into forest, they would shoot something, and he gave me some feedback. And then I made a new version, and actually another version. And if you see how that changes, this is the standard RE Rec 709 1886. If you look at the scope here, how the colors change. Then the warm colors are a little bit pushed and saturated. And with the Rumours version 2, and then with the version 3 even more, but we didn't really like that anymore, with some, like the lips and so on, being too much. So this is the original again. They actually decided for the version 2, and they shot some tests with that. From these tests, well, let's say that was in between with these test shots, I assembled a little bit of collage to show them the differences between the different versions, something I like to do because it makes it easier to communicate. If you pick also maybe practical light source like the torch here and so on, to see the differences and have one still image that communicates a bit more of these aspects than just a than just the RE standard test chart. So I'm gonna maybe fast forward here a little bit because we're getting to an end. Have to get to an end. These have actually also some textures applied. It's anyway in this viewing conditions doesn't make much sense. I can maybe I go full screen with that. Mhm. He was mostly testing also the lighting. There's a lot of the film takes place in a forest, so he was using LED lights to light the backgrounds with very different scenarios, lighting scenarios. The directors were so happy with how the rushes looked that were applied by the DIT during production, only using CDL corrections with the lookup table for the rushes, that they also decided for the final grading to really use this look. Since I built that using certain plugins, I could then provide the appropriate lookup tables also for the various masters in P3 and HDR and so on to the grading facility. And that worked out astonishingly well. The film was, if you didn't catch it, Rumours, I think it's not in cinemas anymore. But I want to give credit to Stefan Ciupek, the DOP of that, who involved me in this project. So if you want to go deeper in this, another recommendation, I did a session 2 years ago as well, where Steve Yedlin, you can see him here, was joining via Zoom, and we talked about his approach, about look management in general, but also with Ari Wagner, about how she approaches the preparation of a project. And she gave also within that, I'm not sure if that's still the link, should be with a document where she did something compared to my list of attributes, but much broader in the sense that she collected all things that basically impact the image, from staging to production design, color, and so on. Just so that she has a list she can think about and just, okay, how do we approach this whole film in regards to this, to that, and so on. I don't know if Dave, did you bring some books? No? Highly recommended. And I also regularly use some stills from that in other lectures at film schools that I do. And something I can also recommend, highly entertaining, very nerdy, but very well made. The guy looks really funny, but he really knows what he does. Captain Disillusion. He recently added another clip about Blur. Very informative. They are all worth watching, especially the thing about color is a 7-minute rundown on human vision, how that works, how we manipulate colors. It's extremely well done. And that's basically it. I hope this was informative. I hope it helps you. Some of this might help you in the future on any of your projects. If you have any questions, I think we still have something like 5 minutes or so. At this point, I would also take questions regarding the recent debunking HDR video from Steve Yedlin, if anyone has seen that.
Hi. You mentioned some plugins you were using for creation of LUTs. Maybe you can say which plugins you are using.
Beyond these, I did buy some DCTLs, like if we want to go specific into Resolve. Certain color manipulations, the hue vectors just never work well enough because they're not built in the right color space. And other DCTLs work differently and work less harmful. So from the free Tetra DCTL to some from Mononode, Stefan Ringelschwandner, a German developer and colorist, to Karl Hendrickson, Tobias Wittmer, who's a friend of mine. He actually gave me one of his DCTLs that he developed himself about film crosstalk. Yeah, I think that's what they call film crosstalk. These are various tools that I use, especially in look development. Yeah. Any other question? Otherwise, I'm going to be at the BVK booth. And I'm happy to see any one of you there. Thanks for joining, and have a great ongoing show.